You're listening to Releasing Trauma, a survivor's podcast. And now here's your host, Tracy Osborne. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Today we are talking about something that I don't think we've actually covered on Releasing Trauma, and it's about school discipline and how it can actually cause trauma in our children. Being a mom of four and having dealt with the schools so many times over the years, this is a really interesting topic for me. And it's a very important topic because I think that, some of the ways that the schools handle our kids just really, it is still very old-fashioned. Joining me today is Dr. Stuart Ablon, and I actually came across an article of his, which I will put in the show notes, regarding discipline in the schools, and that's what really prompted me to bring him on and talk to him today about this. So, Dr. Ablon, thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you coming on. This is such a big topic, and especially right now, I think, because tensions are really high with the COVID and, all the stuff that we're dealing with. We're short-staffed, and, people are just, they're not necessarily operating in their fully right minds, I think, So, let's just dive into this topic. School discipline is not what it was back when you and I were in school. I don't think they still use the paddle. I hope not anyway.
Believe it or not, there are a bunch of states in the U.S. that do use the paddle. And
seriously,
many states where it's not illegal to use corporal punishment in schools. But yes, I agree. School discipline has changed, although to be honest, the sort of basic tenets behind school discipline and what it's mostly focused on, I would argue actually haven't changed a lot in the 40 plus years since I was in elementary school.
Wow, I can't believe they're still doing corporal punishment in school, especially in this day and age.
Right.
If we can't spank our kids at home without bringing down the wrath of John Q. Public, how can they do it in school?
Well, I think states where it's not allowed for parents to spank their children, it's not allowed in the schools as well. But look, whether it's corporal punishment in schools or spanking at home, the reality is that neither of those things actually goes about solving the problems that lead to kids having a hard time managing their behavior in the first place. And Tracy, you pointed out right now in the midst of the pandemic, none of us are operating at our best. And there's a lot of challenging behavior out there everywhere, not just kids, because we're all pretty tapped out. And, our educators have been doing unbelievable work during this pandemic to try their best to meet the needs of kids. But, those needs are only going to get worse because trauma is one of the many things that leads to challenging behavior in the first place. And sadly, there's a lot of trauma coming out of this pandemic.
Oh, definitely. Kids are locked in with abusers. They're locked in with parents that are addicts or alcoholics. And so, I think we're seeing a rise in trauma, not necessarily just with kids, but just with everybody. I know domestic violence is on the rise, all of that. So this pandemic has really pushed us to our limits.
It has. And, we have a saying in our work that sort of guides all of our work, and that is that when applied to kids, we say kids do well if they can. Not kids do well if they want to, but actually kids do well if they can, because we think all kids want to do well. And if they could do well, they would do well. And you can apply that to adults too, whether it's an adult, a parent, struggling with their own challenges, substance use issues, et cetera. People do well if they can. We're all doing the best we can to handle what the world's thrown at us with the skills we're able to access in the moment. And this is a tough time because a lot's being thrown at people. And ironically, when we're very frustrated and stressed, it's hardest for us to access the skills we need to handle tough situations in the first place.
Absolutely.
But, getting back to school discipline, the reality is that, unfortunately, we still look through a very conventional lens when it comes to discipline. We still think that kids are behaving poorly when they are, in order to get things or get out of things and stuff like that. And that's just not true. Kids who really struggle on a chronic basis to manage their behavior, they don't lack the will to behave well. They're not purposefully misbehaving. What they lack are the skills to behave well. And where school discipline has begun to finally shift is to look more at skill than will. And schools that are doing the best job serving the needs of these kids see this like any other kind of learning disability in a school, that kids who struggle with their behavior are lacking in skills. And what they need is not more punishment, rewards, incentives. What they need is help building those skills.
Absolutely. And it goes along with they reward good behavior, they punish the bad behavior, but they forget to look into what is causing that bad behavior. What's causing them to act out? Are they bored? Do they not understand something? Is there something going on at home? I think teachers just kind of dismiss them because they're so overworked nowadays.
Well, I was going to say, I just mentioned people do well if they can. Let's be clear. Teachers do well if they can.
Right.
I've never met a teacher who likes having an out of control kid or a classroom. It's one of the toughest professions out there, and recently just got even harder and even worse. So, look, I think teachers are our everyday heroes in many ways. Unfortunately, they're often not trained in what we have learned about the brain and development and the impact of trauma on the brain's development. And even when they are, a lot of schools these days do receive training in being sort of trauma-sensitive, as they call it. It's another question to say, all right, I understand the impact of trauma on behavior, but what do I do about it? And when you're trying to run a classroom with 20 odd kids and teach an academic curriculum in the midst of a pandemic, you need some really concrete tools to know how to operationalize that. So I have great empathy for our teachers who are working overtime to meet the needs of these kids, but they need help. They need help with practical tools, to be honest.
What are some of those practical tools that you've mentioned?
Well, there are a number of approaches that are alternatives to traditional school discipline. We teach one that we call collaborative problem solving, but there are others too. They are what I would call relational approaches. Another example is restorative practices that are used in a lot of schools these days. Those are examples of relational approaches. And basically what it is it's recognizing, as I said before, that these kids don't need motivators to behave well. What they need, as we teach, is they need help identifying what are the problems they're having a hard time managing during the course of the school day, the triggers, the expectations, the antecedents. Why are those things hard for them? What skills are they struggling with that if they had those skills or could access them, they'd be able to handle those situations better? And then how can we help build those skills? And in our work, one of the things we've shown is that kids who struggle to manage their behavior, they lack problem-solving skills. It's as simple as that. Problem-solving skills like flexibility and frustration tolerance and perspective taking and things like that. Well, the best way to help a kid learn to teach them problem-solving skills is to practice problem-solving with them. And so an example of a practical tool is a problem-solving process that you can use in a proactive way again and again with a kid to try to solve the problems that are leading to their challenging behavior, but also help them build the skills that they're struggling with that are causing that challenging behavior at the same time. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Gotcha. And I think we're so quick to judge and want to label these kids that are acting out, that do have issues. They're ADD, they're ADHD, they've got this, they've got that. We need to just put them on medicine, when so much of it is not necessarily related to mental illness or anything like that. Why are we so quick to just start shoving pills down our kids' throats?
Well, it's a complicated question and answer because honestly, do I think there are lots of kids in our schools and other places where we are sort of moving way too quickly to medicine and medicine's not the right answer? Yes. But the research also suggests there's a whole bunch of kids who could benefit from medicine that is prescribed appropriately and effectively who aren't getting it at all. So this notion that sort of, kids are over medicated or things like that, that's actually not accurate.
Okay.
What we need, though, is we need to be better about assessing what factors are leading to a kid's struggles and knowing that some of those are good targets of change for medicine. In other words, medicine can help for some of those things, but there's a whole bunch of things that medicine can't help with. So let me be very concrete with you. Attention deficit disorder is a real thing. And there are some kids who have severe attentional issues and impulse control issues and real difficulty controlling their activity level. Medicine can be really helpful, even life-saving for some of those kids. And those are some of the kids who experience behavioral challenges at school. So that's a good example of where it might work. There's a whole set of kids who struggle with flexibility, what we psychologists call cognitive flexibility. They're what I would call the sort of rigid, concrete, literal black and white thinkers stuck in a gray world. And whenever the world throws gray at them at school, they have a very hard time. Well, you know what? We don't have a gray pill. And so there's no medicine that's going to help a kid whose flexibility or inflexibility is causing their behavioral challenges. We've got to bark up a different clinical tree if we are going to try to help a kid with flexibility issues. And there are other examples. Let's say our research has shown that a lot of kids who struggle to manage their behavior have delays in language and communication skills, because language and communication is really critical to letting people know what you need, what's bothering you, to have a back and forth to solve a problem. No medicine is going to fix a language processing issue, for instance, but there are other interventions that can. So it's about a good assessment, understanding what's leading to challenging behavior, knowing that it's not simply a lack of motivation, that there are other things, figuring out what those other things are, and medicine could help for some and won't help for others. Because ultimately, medicine can be life-saving, but pills don't teach skills, is the reality. Pills can put somebody in a position to learn skills, but they don't build skills.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense. I mean, I have my oldest daughter, we put her on Ritalin when she was 3 because she was severely ADHD. Whereas my third daughter, medicine won't help her because she has a chromosomal deficiency. She has DiGeorge syndrome. So, what will work for one kid isn't going to necessarily work for another kid, and especially, or even in the same family.
Well, and that's why, whether it's parenting or teaching, one size does not fit all.
Right.
And there's an outdated notion that the most important thing you can be as a parent with multiple kids or in a classroom is consistent. Treat every kid the same. That's a myth. Treat every kid the same just ensures that nobody gets what they need, because kids are very different. I got 3 kids of my own, and their personalities are dramatically different. Sometimes it's hard to imagine they share the same DNA. They're so different. And in a classroom with 20 odd kids, it's the same thing. You've got very different kids who are struggling with very different things. And the best kind of classroom, honestly, is one where everybody gets what they need. And to give everybody what they need means you have to do different things for different people, for sure.
But are we asking too much of our teachers? Because you have one teacher for 20, 30 kids. How are they going to be able to give every single kid what they need?
That's why it's the hardest job out there. Because it's also, a teacher's primary job is to teach an academic curriculum while managing all the social, emotional, behavioral things that come up in the context of it. So it's extraordinarily hard. And in many cases, I think it can be mission impossible to meet every kid's needs like this. And, in the midst of a pandemic like this with chronic stress all the way around, it really is impossible. And that's why we've seen, so many kids really struggling because they haven't made the developmental progress they usually do when teachers aren't sort of, drowning under stress all around them, trying to do this incredibly hard job.
Have you noticed, any difference or I'm not sure if that's the right way to word it, but now that we've got cell phones in the classrooms, kids are taking videos of things that are going on. So is that affecting how our teachers are behaving, knowing that they could be recorded at any moment? Or
I work with a lot of teachers. I haven't heard that as a primary concern because teachers are doing their best to give kids what they need at all times, and I don't think they're preoccupied with sort of getting caught doing something wrong because they're trying to do something right.
Right.
I haven't heard that, to be honest.
Well, that's good. That's good. I think we just see it a lot more now that we have the ability to record things that do happen. And not necessarily just from the teachers, but from the kids too, acting out, bullying each other, all of that kind of stuff. We're able to capture it and post it for the world to see. So I think it's almost a catch-22. In one way, it's opening our eyes to it, that, there are problems in our educational system, and not just with the staff, but with the students. But then also, I think it can cause some problems too, because people are like, oh my gosh, that's horrible. That teacher yelled at that kid, or they did this, or they did that. And so, I wonder if, just having that kind of technology, how that really affects the overall academia world.
Well, look, technology definitely has its downsides for sure. Yeah. But as we've learned over the last couple of years, it has its upsides for sure as well, or else we would have had at least a year with no schooling whatsoever.
Oh, for sure.
As challenging as remote school was, and it is certainly better than no schooling. But, I think, the most important thing here to do is to avoid what usually happens with challenging behavior of any kind. And that is a bit of a blame game that happens where, people start pointing fingers. Is it, the kid's fault? Is it the teacher's fault? Is it the parents' fault? Is it the principal's fault? And again, people do well if they can. We're all trying the best here that we can. And if a kid is really struggling, it's incumbent upon the adults to get together and say to themselves, what's getting in this kid's way? Why is this kid struggling? We know he'd prefer to be doing well. She'd prefer to be doing well. They'd prefer to be doing well if they could. What's getting in their way, and how can we be most helpful? And I think, thankfully these days we really do finally recognize that chronic stress and trauma impacts brain development. There's no doubt about it. And what that looks like downstream is it looks like lagging skills, which cause behavioral challenges. And if it's trauma that impacts brain development that leads to those behavioral challenges, you don't want to use power-based interventions like rewards and consequences to fix something that trauma has caused. Not at all. So that's probably the most important take-home message when it comes to the impact of trauma and what that means for school discipline.
I also wonder if rewards and consequences are really all that great to begin with. I mean, I'm sitting here thinking, you've got the student who is academically or physically above everybody else. Then you've got the one who's struggling, and they're watching these other kids get stuff. They get prizes, they get parties, they get, and they can't, and it's not their fault. And so that's got to really screw with their self-esteem.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, we're talking about kids with trauma histories now, but let's be clear. I don't think rewards and punishments are very helpful for many folks. The reality is the kids who have the skills to behave well do. So you don't need them for those kids. And the kids who you do need them for, they don't work very well. And as you're pointing out, they've got a lot of side effects. They make kids feel badly about themselves. And the other thing that we don't pay enough attention to is there's like tons of research. I mean, literally tens of thousands, I'm not exaggerating, of studies that show that if you use a carrot on a stick to try to incentivize somebody to do something, that person, kid or adult, will get more motivated to get the carrot, but they actually get less motivated to achieve the goal you want them to achieve. They actually lose some of their intrinsic drive to achieve the goal. So, Yeah, rewards and consequences can be very harmful for kids with trauma histories, but they leave a lot to be desired for all kids and have significant side effects as well.
Absolutely. So what are some, I know we've talked about a few things in the beginning about, some other ways that the teachers can work with their students, but overall in the education system, do we need to make our teachers more trauma informed? Do we need to give them more training and education on that?
I actually think there's a decent amount of training on being trauma informed or trauma sensitive these days. That is understanding the impact of trauma on kids and their development and their behavior. I think we're doing much better in our schools with that. Where I think we're leaving a lot to be desired is okay, now what? Because you're going to have all the trauma-informed training, that you can possibly get that puts you in a much more empathic, understanding position. But when a kid is disrupting your whole classroom, behaving in a very disrespectful way to you, and maybe even in a dangerous, unsafe, or threatening way, you need something to do very practically.
Yeah.
And, we adults, when we're sort of under threat, we look to regain power and control. So all the training goes out the window, and we reach for those common things. So, I think our teachers do need help. They need training, professional development, but it needs to be oriented to, okay, what do I do? How do I handle this specific situation? If I'm not going to try to threaten a consequence in this moment or lord a threat of a punishment over a kid's head, what do I do instead? How do I handle this? Give me practical advice that is in line with that training in being trauma sensitive. And that's harder to do. That's a lot harder to do. And, if folks are interested in what that looks like, as I mentioned, I check out approaches I described. Restorative practices are a good example. Our collaborative problem-solving approach, good example. People can go to our website. Mm-hmm. There's a ton of training there. You can learn all about it. That's very practical. Here's what to do instead.
Okay. And listeners, we'll make sure all of Dr. Ablon's information is in the show notes. As always, just go to releasingtraumapodcast.com and pull up his episode, and all his contact information will be there. One thing I want to mention before we wrap up is just also, we can't just drop this on our educators. I think all too often, so many parents are like, they are your problem from 8 to 3. Or 8 to 2, or whatever the time frame is, and they don't want to be involved in that what happens in that time frame. And so we have to remember, as parents, we're a team with the educators. We have to team up with them and work together in order to make it the best learning experience for our kids. And I think that just doesn't get expressed nearly enough.
Yeah, I agree. And the communication and collaboration between home and school is so crucial. But again, I want to point out, I think one of the reasons there's a breakdown there is the blame game. Mm-hmm. Historically, we blame parents for their kids' behavior, and parents often then blame the teacher if the behavior looks bad at school, especially if it doesn't look so bad at home. Right. And it's just not that simple. School is much harder to navigate for some kids than home, and vice versa, because of their particular constellation of skills and lagging skills. And so assuming the best from each other, assuming the best intent, and trying to collaborate and work together is absolutely where we need to be going.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Ablon, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about this today. This is a very important topic, and I think it's one that we really need to talk about more, for sure.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I hope the conversation and some resources will be helpful for folks.
I hope so as well. And listeners, for all of you out there who are educators, I just want to say thank you, because it is an enormous job. A relatively thankless job. And, it's a very important job. So I just want to say thank you so much for the dedication and the hard work that you do to educate our kids. And, as always, and thank you. As always, thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and we will talk to you in the next show. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure you hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss a show. Be sure to check us out on our new socials on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.